Hello, everybody. Mike Trace here. This is the latest in my series of Chief Executive vlogs. I'm the Chief Executive of the Forward Trust, and we've been looking mainly recently at areas of policy, social policy, drug policy, criminal justice policy that affect the Forward Trust, but are also of interest of anybody who works in our area. This time we thought it's kind of a summer recess for UK policy, all the politicians going on holiday, and we thought we'd step away from the chaos and the struggles of UK social policy and have a look at the chaos and struggles around global drug policy, the United Nations, the war on drugs, and what happens in those debates. Now, I've chosen this subject particularly for my Forward Trust colleagues is because, as most of my colleagues may not know, I was for many years earlier in my career, I was a senior and sometimes controversial actor in the world of global drug policy. So what I'm going to do here is explain my involvement in United Nations, international diplomacy, and then talk a little bit about how the global drug control system has developed and all of the arguments and political debates about how that system works. So to introduce my role in it, apologies for a while, I'm going to be talking about me, but it's important to set the scene for what comes later. And I think it's important to say that these policy issues, these political issues, they are massively complex and been going on for 100 years. And I'm going to try and do a summary of it in 10 or 15 minutes. So bear with me. It's going to have some very broad statements. But if you're interested in follow-up questions or more details about any aspect of this, very happy to talk about it. So my background, you may or may not know, I was a prison drug worker. A lot of you do the similar jobs now, but I was a prison drug worker back in the 1980s, 1990s. Worked on the wings around London prisons, some of the prisons in East Anglia. That's where I learnt most of what I know now about addiction, recovery, criminal justice, was as a worker on the wings. Through various accidents of history, I was parachuted in to the Tony Blair government in 1997. It's when Labour last got in, and Tony Blair was the Prime Minister, as you know, and they created two drug czars. They were very worried about the drug problem. They were under pressure from the Americans to do more about drug control, and they thought they better appoint some drug czars to sort the drug problem out. And from a weird coincidence, me as a prison drug worker ended up as one of those czars. The other one was a police chief called Keith Helliwell, who was obviously much more involved in law enforcement, and I was the demand reduction, prevention and treatment guy. And I'm not going to talk much about my time in UK government, but just to say, if you didn't know, the first national drug strategy and the first prison drug strategy, those were both authored largely by me. So I feel a real affinity to what government does around drug use and drug treatment, because I was the guy who was in charge of it for several years. So the birth of the sector that many of you now work in, if you work in substance misuse in the community and prisons, the birth of that sector was in the late 1990s, where we poured an awful lot of money and ideas into developing a national treatment system for people with drug and alcohol problems in the UK. So that's sort of my background knowledge, but it's also an explanation of why I get quite angry when policy and commissioning these days seems to me to be going in the wrong direction. So I feel a real affinity to that, and that will explain why I get so involved in that. Now, because of my work in the UK, and I was drug czar of the UK when the issue of drugs policy was quite a hot topic internationally, I ended up going to quite a few, representing the UK at quite a few international meetings. And because diplomats and government officials who were responsible for drug policy, most of them were in no way experts on drug policy, it wasn't difficult for me to look good, because I was one of the few people who had actually worked in the sector, had actually had frontline experience. So I had quite a growing reputation around the late 1990s in these international meetings of, yeah, this guy knows what he's talking about. It was quite easy to look good. As a result of that growing reputation, I got elected the president of the European Union's drugs agency. It was called at the time the European Monitoring Centre on Drugs and Drug Addiction, but it was basically all the countries of the European Union worked together, mainly on research, but it was kind of the best practice agency of the European Union around drugs. So it was where the 27 countries got together to talk about drugs policy and drugs issues. I became elected president of that in 2000, which gives you a very sort of high profile. You're involved in all the top level meetings. And not long after that, I was headhunted to I'm still working for the UK government, but I was headhunted to become the lead of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which is the United Nations Drugs Agency. And I was headhunted to lead their demand reduction section, pretty much the first ever head of their demand reduction section. But the agency, as I'll explain later, is very much focused on law enforcement and supply reduction, but they were trying to balance that out with work on prevention and treatment. And I was appointed to a very senior diplomatic position at this agency in Vienna to try and improve and increase their work around demand reduction. I lasted in that job 4 months and was forced out through sort of political pressure. That whole process is another story. I'm happy to tell anybody who wants to listen to it. But basically, I was pushed out of that role because I was broadly seen as too liberal. When they appointed me, they thought this guy's a real expert, real energetic, come and bring some demand reduction expertise. But a lot of governments had a look at my CV and some of the things I'd said, particularly my support for what was then a very contested issue in the UN, which is harm reduction, which is public health measures for people using drugs. And I was generally seen as a public health guy, a liberal guy. And in the UN at that time, that was very controversial. So a number of governments got together, forced me out, and that was the end of my UN diplomatic career. Now, my story is not all that important in it, but it does give you an idea of how weird United Nations international drug policy had become by the late 90s, early 2000s. I'm going to try and explain now a little bit of a historical perspective of how it had got to that point that we were basically in a global war on drugs, and just about every government around the world was keen on saying, yeah, we're going to eradicate drugs from the planet, and we're going to do that by supply reduction and repression. That was pretty much the universal view when I arrived on the scene. And to say people like me saying, well, actually, it's more about health, treatment, addiction, were not universally popular. So what are the historical processes that got us into this reasonable, strange position by the end of the 20th century where everything was about supply reduction and deterrence and enforcement? If we look back on the global war on drugs, which I think is a thing, it's a slogan, but it definitely was what was most countries were trying to implement through most of the 20th century. If you look back historically, that war on drugs hasn't existed for most of social history. Before the 1920s, there were no real moves anywhere in the world to prohibit psychoactive substances, either at national or regional or global level. You had through the 19th century alcohol temperance movements pointing out the bad effects of alcohol addiction or drunkenness. But at the same time, you had countries like the UK prosecuting the Opium Wars, which was an attempt to get China and other areas around it to support the opium trade, legal opium trade, protect it. So through the centuries, there were all these psychoactive substances used to varying degrees around the world in different cultures, different settings, but no real move to take a war on drugs approach or a prohibition approach. That only came into being in the early 20th century. So between the two world wars in the 1920s, there were moves at the League of Nations, which was the version of the United Nations that existed at the time. And those moves were originally came up to try and control concerns around cannabis primarily. And a lot of these discussions back in the 1920s, 1930s, they had deep imperial roots. In fact, the diplomats at the League of Nations that were really pushing this idea of we've got to control cannabis, the the main push came from Egypt, but it was basically the British colonial authorities in Egypt. It was a local concern, a local worry about certain sections of the population there growing and using cannabis, and they took that to the League of Nations and started to build the structures that ended up becoming the UN drug control system. So it was an imperial process, and it was the UK and certain individual diplomats in the UK that really started the first drive to internationalize this issue. But that happened around the same time as US alcohol prohibition. So around the same time in the US, the authorities were trying to prohibit alcohol and stop Al Capone and others producing and distributing illegal alcohol. And so there was a lot of enthusiasm in the US government, US or law enforcement authorities, who were becoming much stronger voices internationally for this general idea of prohibiting substances and stopping people producing and using them. Obviously, the Second World War intervened, and in the 1950s, what was happening is the growth of what we now know as the United Nations structures, or the legal treaties, the human rights treaties, and the structures of the United Nations. Those all grew up through the late 40s and 1950s, and that coincided with obviously what we know of as US hegemony. The United States was the clearly dominant international power at the time and had an awful lot of influence at the creation and the operation of these new United Nations entity. And that did coincide with domestically in the US, the government was in full swing of its war on drugs within their country. So they had institutions and politicians who were driving this idea, once again, quite imperial, quite racist, this idea that drug use was a scourge on society, and it was being driven by foreigners. Opium was coming in from China. Marijuana, as they called it, was coming in from Mexico. And this must be stopped, and the way to stop it was through harsh law enforcement. You may see some parallels to things you hear from US politicians now. You know, it's Mexico's bringing in fentanyl. And China's bringing in fentanyl, and we're going to put tariffs on them because they're causing the drug problem in the US. So this is a well-worn political strategy that was definitely playing out in the 1950s in the US role within the United Nations. And the result of that, US were very good at exerting power, very good at turning power into international agreements. So the creation at the United Nations of a series of drug control treaties. The first one, main one, 1961, supplementary one, strengthening that system in 1971, and one that brought into the same system synthetic drugs, laboratory-produced drugs, in 1988. So 3 treaties, 1961, 71, 88, massively complex legal documents, but they enshrine the war on drugs philosophy as the UN approach to this. And they are international treaties, they are international laws, and every member state of the UN is expected to uphold and implement the certain approach to drug policy in their domestic legislation. And almost all members of the United Nations through the 70s, 80s and 90s signed and ratified these treaties and introduced domestic legislation to implement that. So these treaties were very complex, but they generally and broadly enshrine the war on drugs philosophy into international agreements. And they are legal agreements. So through the 80s and 90s, every country in the world, almost every country in the world, had signed and ratified these treaties, which made them responsible in their own country to pursue the same legislation, the same approach. And these treaties also set up the law enforcement structures internationally, but also in national governments that would implement the war on drugs. So everybody had sort of drug enforcement agencies. The UN created the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which was basically a law enforcement entity. And this was all very celebrated at the time. It's often forgotten that the creation of these treaties were celebrated as the first global social policy agreements, where the whole world had agreed there was a particular threat, psychoactive drugs, and they'd all agreed that they would follow the same approach in response to it. And this was celebrated at the time, a big diplomatic achievement. Obviously, experience since has shown that trying to create a global social policy is actually very difficult. There are massively different cultures, social conditions around the world. So trying to have a straitjacket or a template that everybody follows is probably not a good idea. But we still do have these UN drug treaties. They remain unamended and unchanged in 2025. So to summarize the war on drugs philosophy in a very short period, I'll do my best. But basically, the idea was, and these are enshrined in the treaties we still have, is that taking psychoactive substances by any individual is universally bad. Obviously, it's recognized that there are medical uses of many of those substances, but the recreational use of psychoactive substances is a bad thing, and anybody engages in them are bad people and are treated as criminals. That's the first, I would say, pillar of war on drugs philosophy. The second pillar is that the best way to react to that bad situation is to try and stop the production of these substances in the first place and to stop them being trafficked around the world. So there has been and still is to some extent a view that the most important thing that governments should be doing is trying to stop the cultivation of opium poppy in Asia, stop the cultivation of coca leaf in Latin America, and if you can't stop it being cultivated, you stop people moving it around from areas of cultivation to consumer markets. That is the second key pillar of a war on drugs approach is, you do law enforcement to stop the production and distribution. And on the consumption side, the war on drugs approach is to universally condemn zero tolerance of drug use, and you follow social and educational and prevention programs that really condemn any form of drug use, and you try to deter people from making the choice to use those substances. And as we know, most of that deterrence comes from the criminal justice system and has been implemented in many countries, very variably around the world, but in many countries has been implemented in the form of strong enforcement and punishment and imprisonment for people who use drugs. So those are the three pillars of a war on drugs approach. They were enshrined in, as I say, the early 1920s legislation, and they're also been the three pillars behind all of the United Nations approaches ever since. Now, there's a problem with all of those three pillars. The first one just is morally inconsistent. If you take the view that a human being ingesting a substance that changes their brain chemistry is a bad thing, then you have to apply that morally to all of those substances. And as you know, most of the world has not applied that logic to alcohol. Islamic states do. They are consistent in that sense. They in their approach to all psychoactive substances, but certainly Western societies say, well, certain psychoactive substances are fundamentally okay, and we'll manage and regulate them as part of our social conditions, and other psychoactive substances are definitely not okay, and we will treat anybody who uses them as bad people. So there's a moral inconsistency right in the initial writing of the terms of the war on of the drugs treaties, which has never been resolved. The second pillar generally developed over the last 50 years. We've become aware that whatever you think about it in principle, the idea of stopping cultivation and distribution of the plants and the drugs, it is impossible in practice. So a lot of billions, trillions of dollars, and wars have been fought, and all sorts of initiatives have been pursued. Law enforcement initiatives have been pursued over the last, particularly 50 or 60 years, to try to stop cultivation, production, and distribution, stop trafficking. And as I'm sure you're all aware, there's more distribution and trafficking and availability of drugs than there were when we started. And it was pretty well known, I would say, in drug policy circles by the 1990s that whether you were a war on drugs advocate or whether you were a liberal on drugs policy, it just wasn't working what the world was trying to do to try and stop production and distribution. All the figures were going in the wrong direction. And as I say, more and more sections of the global population had access to the drugs that they wanted to use. So we were not stopping the flow. Now, how different authorities and individuals reacted to that knowledge, that research-based knowledge, is really interesting because, half the world doubled down and said, just means we have to try harder, get tougher. And the other half, including people like me, were saying, well, actually, maybe our strategy is wrong. We need to rethink. As I say, anybody at the UN in the late 90s, early 2000s who took the latter position was going to get a kick in. And I certainly experienced that. The third pillar, the idea that we should have zero tolerance, condemn and deter drug consumption, and we should do that by arresting and imprisoning people. That was massively damaging, has been massively damaging in many countries around the world. The actual active social exclusion of sections of society by saying, okay, we have zero tolerance for your chosen behavior and we're going to try to make you excluded from mainstream society, and the use of a criminal justice system to arrest, punish, imprison large numbers of those people has a big effect on society, probably a much bigger effect on society, a negative effect on society than the drug use in the first place. And also very discriminatory impact on society. As you can imagine, most governments, particularly authoritarian ones, they really enjoyed having these drug law powers and enforcing them. And of course, they were enforced unequally and still enforced unequally on the population. Classic one we'll talk about in the UK now is if you're a relatively well-off, relatively white user, you are unlikely to ever have your cannabis use attended to by the law enforcement authorities. Maybe the UK is a bad example, but the US, which is the country that pursued this deterrence approach most enthusiastically from about the late 70s to recently, at the peak of that war on drugs in the US, they had 2.3 million people in prison, and they were trying to deter and create the circumstances where their population would not use drugs because they're the fear of imprisonment. And they got up to a prison population of over 2 million and still had the highest drug use rates in Western society. So, so much social damage from the policy trying to resolve the damage of the drug use created more problems it has solved, and I think that lesson's largely been learnt, even by the US, but as I'm about to explain, hasn't led to significant policy change around the world. So these truths, the three pillars of the war on drugs, all of them were not really working very well. These truths are pretty clear to experts by the time I arrived at the United Nations in the late 1990s. But that period of universal adherence and enthusiasm for the war on drugs, which I'd broadly say would be from the 60s to the 90s, was followed by a period of staunch defense of a failing strategy. So most countries, as you say, thought maybe they react to the realities and the research and the learning, but most countries doubled down on the war on drugs, particularly the US. So going back to the 90s, the US politically and diplomatically put an awful lot of effort into maintaining war on drugs approach and pressuring countries who wanted to do something different to stay loyal to the existing treaties. But they were also supported in that by a whole range of countries. During that period, the US, Russia, and China were all locked in arms trying to defend the UN drug treaties and the UN war on drugs, and dozens of other broadly authoritarian countries who actually quite liked the money that was going into their law enforcement systems. They quite liked the idea that they could repress certain groups in society using the drug laws as a mechanism. So there's a lot of countries at the UN then and still now who are saying, well, we quite like the war on drugs and we want to continue it. A weird outlier, by the way, was Sweden. Sweden, very well known as a broadly socially liberal country and genuinely so, and generally so for many years. But there has always been in Sweden a strong temperance movement that led to them, particularly in the 80s and 90s, being very strong outlier within Europe, saying Europe should not have liberal drug policies. So while Sweden had liberal social policies on just about everything else, on alcohol and drugs, it was always a a zero tolerance world. It's changed somewhat in the last 10 or 20 years, but certainly when I was over there, Sweden was a tricky government to deal with around these issues. So why, if the evidence is pretty clear that the strategy and the treaty vision was not working, have most countries continued to defend repression-based drugs policies? And there's three reasons for that, in my view. The war on drugs is extremely useful for politicians and institutions. First of all, it's very useful, and its origins were in this idea. You can blame all sorts of social problems on outsiders through drugs. So, if you're an inequality in society or conflict in society, it's quite an easy thing for leaders to do, to say, well, that's because of heroin dealing, or that's because of cannabis making people lazy. And this is still used by many politicians in many countries today as a justification for the social policies they want to follow. So yeah, it's a very easy way to blame much more entrenched, difficult problems on, yeah, it's the drugs and the drug market. Second reason why the war on drugs is or repressive approaches are still attractive is it's a very good way to expand law enforcement resources. So when I was in UK government, one of my roles was to sort of approve or sign off budgets around drugs issues, supply reduction as well as demand reduction. And yeah, police forces, every law enforcement agency, including the military, including the intelligence agencies, they always were coming up with bids for getting more money in order to save the country from the drug scourge. Now, some of that is perfectly good work, and there was some amazing work done on supply reduction and law enforcement by those agencies in the UK. But fundamentally, it was a budget stream for them, and a very lucrative budget stream for them. And the UK, I don't think, is a particularly bad example of that. Once again, the US, you look at the US and Russia and places like that, they have massive drug law enforcement institutions who don't want to give up their budgets. And if you accept you can't stop the production and distribution of drugs around the world, then basically you'd stop spending on those institutions, and they don't want that. And the third reason I think that the policy remains attractive is authoritarianism. We are going through a stage of global geopolitics where authoritarian governments are in the ascendancy. And the idea behind authoritarian governments is that you want as much control as possible of your population. And it's done in different ways in different systems. China does it very differently than African countries. Africa does it very differently than Trump's America. But generally, authoritarian governments want as many powers as possible that they can use to act against people they find a threat or they don't like. And drug policy is great for that. So I suppose the most sordid versions of that is in Philippines recently, 15 years ago, President Duterte, and before that, and many people have forgotten this, in Thailand, the government of Thailand back in the early 2000s declared a war on drugs and say, drugs is a threat to our society. But what they basically did is use their military and law enforcement powers to go out and arrest, kill, and disappear people they found awkward. And so the drug policy is basically a screen for just taking on people in society that you don't agree with. So it's very attractive for authoritarians to have that sort of power, and drug policy is a good smokescreen. So bringing it more up to date, that sounds all very apocryphal, but last 10, 20 years, the debate has become more balanced internationally. And if you read the United Nations reports now, they're very clear that the framework that's been in place for the best part of a century is not working, and there are problems, but they're still not changing the framework. The treaties are still there, they're unamended, and there are big rows in Vienna every year when governments get together to talk about what happens next. And they're not going to come to a consensus when there are the authoritarians and the liberals who fundamentally disagree. But in a sense, that's progress, because you know, it is a much better situation. Governments can now find their own way, whether they want to regulate cannabis or pursue harm reduction policies and pursue public health approaches or treatment of addiction processes. You know, governments are pretty much free to do that. They're not going to get pressure from Americans or Russians. They're not going to get letters from the United Nations saying you're not allowed to be doing that. So the government dynamics have changed an awful lot the last 10 or 20 years. I'm very proud to have been involved in setting up some of the structures. I didn't stay as a UN diplomat for very long, but I spent a fair while setting up structures for experts and NGOs to be more influential in these places where non-experts generally talk about drug policy. So there's two organizations that I've been involved in the founding of. One's called International Drug Policy Consortium, wonderful network of NGOs around the world who work on drug policy issues and take a voice to the United Nations. And there's a thing called the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which is basically a grouping of former government politicians, you know, a lot of heads of state, you know, are on that global commission, and they have had a lot of influence, a lot of writing around why the war on drugs needs to come to an end. So I was involved in the setting up of both those organisations, and they're really strong voices now that challenge the century of misdirection, I would call it. And also some of the UN structures, the United Nations Health and Human Rights, the World Health Organization, the Human Rights Commission, various UN entities are now openly saying that it's time for the world to stop this, as I say, mistaken century of direction. So there are some loud voices. There are lots of good initiatives and different things being done by government. So we have come out of this period of a straitjacket of a war on drugs, but there are still many parts of the world where it's enthusiastically prosecuted. Just one final thing to say, a reasonably hopeful thing, I hope, is that the last meeting of the what's called the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. That's all the countries coming together each year to say, what are we going to do about the drug problem? They have commissioned a fundamental review through the United Nations to say what is the current situation, what are our future options, and that's great. The countries have agreed to commission that review, but as you can imagine, all the countries are now trying to fight to get control of that review. I think there's meant to be 13 commissioners doing the review. Russia's trying to get his people on it, America's trying to get their people on it, so on and so forth. So the review might be a very good piece of work, or it might be a highly politicized piece of work, but it'll happen over the next few years. So that's very, very simplistic review of my adventures in global drug policy. Obviously, every single thing I've said there, you will say, well, you know, there's a load of detail behind that. You know, tell us the detail, but there isn't a podcast long enough for it, or a vlog long enough for that. I hope I've given you a sense of it and a sense of my involvement in it. And obviously, particularly Forward Trust colleagues, if you want to know more anytime, just let me know. But thanks for your attention. Hope this vlog has been interesting.